to have the amount of reviews that you have is really impressive on Amazon. That must have caught fire, at
Well,
least for Proof of Heaven. I mean, that
it,
is
it absolutely did catch fire, and part of it, I can tell you, was, and I heard from thousands of people after it first came out, who said that it reminded them of something deep in their own kind of soul memory. And many of them, they might have been kind of skeptical, materialist types and everything, and yet the reading of my book reminded them of something in their own deep history that resonated. So I think that was really one reason the book hit with such power. I mean, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction for 2 years. It was number one in that list for 42 weeks. So for an
wow.
NDE book, that's absolutely unheard of. And then, of course, it's been published in over 40 countries. So there's a lot of interest out there. And I think it just reflects that these experiences are very common. And people, are pretty tired of the erroneous materialist interpretation that pretends it's all dreams or hallucinations,
Hmm.
because they realize there's much more going on than a dream or hallucination. So I
Oh
think that's one
gosh,
of the
it's
reasons the book hit so well with such power.
yeah, and that was 2012 is when you published it?
2012 when Proof of Heaven came out. Now, also, have you read Living in a Mindful Universe, the third book?
No, I have not read that. No.
Oh, well, that you should read that at some point, because I look at Proof of Heaven, the book, as a big question mark. It says, wow, these things happen, they're real, but how do we explain them? And then I have Map of Heaven, which talks about how common they are. But then the third book is the real continuation and Proof of Heaven, and it's the real proof of heaven, and that's Living in a Mindful Universe. That was a book I wrote with my wife, Karen Newell, who is also a lifetime spiritual investigator, meditator, etc. So she's got deep spiritual wisdom. But that book is what really brings the science and spirituality together, is Living in a Mindful Universe. Highly recommended.
I love that. I will absolutely purchase this after this conversation. I appreciate you being here. I would love to for the audience to maybe for those who don't know who you are, Dr. Eben Alexander, I would love to dive into your very first experience, which sounds like is the catalyst to
Right.
everything that came after it, your books, but also the talks and just your journey as a whole. So I know
Absolutely.
you had a coma, was brought on by, was it meningitis? It was a
Right.
bacteria infection.
Now, I can give you all the details.
Would love to talk about that. Let's jump into that.
All right. Well, first of all, at the time, 2008, in November, in fact, it was right around this week, it was November 10th that I went into coma. And that was in 2008. And at that time, I was 54-year-old, neurosurgeon trained in conventional materialist, physicalist science. And I fully believed I had some understanding of brain, mind, consciousness, how it all worked. But it was that conventional viewpoint, which I will tell you now has been roundly rejected by a lot of the scientific field. And then also important to point out that I was very influenced by my adoptive father. Now, notice I said adopted. That's a giant piece of my story. You can't miss how important it is in the overall story that my birth mother was 16 years old and unwed and had to put me up for adoption when I was actually 11 days old, but she wouldn't sign the papers to give me away until I was 4 months old. So I was stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months waiting for that to happen. Anyway, bottom line is I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. My adoptive father was very influential in my life. Um, an academic neurosurgeon. He had trained at Harvard and was just an amazing guy, wonderful, loving soul. But for him, he had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater, New Guinea, Philippines, and Japan. I still have at my bedside a little pocket Bible that he had that was with him his whole 2 years overseas. And I think it's what brought him back relatively sane was his very strong belief in God and prayer. He was also extremely scientific, fully up to speed on all modern neuroscience, cosmology, etc. And for him, there was never a conflict. He always knew the reality of God and power of prayer. He used it in his work all the time. But like many who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I always knew science is the pathway to truth. I wasn't going to buy into any kind of religious ideologies and scripture from thousands of years ago when I had access to science to tell me about what was going on. Now, I made a big mistake, like many in the modern world, in thinking that Newtonian deterministic science was the pathway to truth, but no, it is not. Quantum physics opens the door to a far richer kind of viewing of the nature of consciousness and the brain-mind connection, and I was just going to discover that this week. So what happened was 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008, woke up with severe back pain, realized soon thereafter, horrible headache. I mean, just terribly sick. And before I knew it, I was lapsing into coma right there at home. Grand mal seizures, gone from this world for the next 7 days. There's a myth out there perpetrated by an irresponsible writer who was trying to discredit me, who said I was in a medically induced coma. One of the most important facts of my coma for the scientific community is that it was caused by meningitis. And the reason that's so important is meningitis is a perfect model for human death. And this was the worst kind of meningitis you could have. It was a gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis that basically attacked my entire brain. There was no part left unscathed, and it was a full-thickness damage to the neocortex, including damage to the brainstem, even on day one. So a horribly a severe case of meningitis, and the severity of it is confirmed not just in my reporting in the book Proof of Heaven, but in a medical case report written on my medical records by 3 doctors not involved in my care but fascinated by my recovery. And that report came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018, by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And the important points of that case report is they make it clear, if you have medical knowledge and read that report, you'll realize there's really no way to postulate that dreams or hallucinations could still come out of my brain, given the damage to the neocortex. That's why it's so important to stress it was not just a medically induced coma at all. It was far more than that. And that, of course, was the deep mystery to me early on in trying to make sense of it. Was the more I learned about my medical records, the more I went, no, this can't be, because I had this experience, which wouldn't have been possible with that kind of damage to the brain. So anyway, getting back to the experience itself, important to point out that one of the biggest features of it, which is very unusual. I've never heard of this to a severe degree in others' NDEs, but in mine, it was there to help me learn the deepest lessons. Amnesia. I had absolutely no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no language, no knowledge of Earth, this universe. It was an empty slate. Where I started in this journey was, it was what I call the earthworm's eye view. It was a primitive, coarse kind of subterranean existence, this pounding monotony. There was no responsiveness to any kind of inquisition in my mind about what was going on around me. Just this slow, steady pounding on an anvil and this murky, muddy, yucky, foreboding environment. And the good news is that didn't last forever. It seemed to go for a long time, but there came a slowly spinning white light that came out of the murky darkness surrounded by these fine silvery and golden tendrils. And as that light came towards me, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of this ugly earthworm eye view realm and led up into this brilliant ultra-real gateway valley. And this is where things get indescribable. You often hear that near-death experiences are ineffable, that they're beyond our language. And that's because our language is great for describing a trip to Disney World, not so great for these incredible spiritual journeys. We need to improve on that language dramatically. But anyway, in this Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. I never had any body sensation at all. I was just aware of my surroundings, but there was nothing to refer to as, my body or me. I just witnessed all these things occurring. And in that setting, I remember in this beautiful Gateway Valley, there was a meadow surrounded by forest, waterfalls sparkling into these crystal blue ponds, thousands of beings dancing in this meadow, joy and merriment, festivities, incredible mirth. And it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. This incredible awe and majesty, and yet, amazingly, it felt like my spiritual home. It's like you get there and go, Ah, yes. Now I remember. So it was beautifully kind of welcoming, comfortable. I mean, very different from, what I might have expected. And in this beautiful setting, I remember I wasn't alone. That's the best part about it. Beside me on this butterfly wing, a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to. Her thoughts of pure emotional truth, mind meld, came right into my awareness. And she basically reassured me. And when I put down her message that was delivered in a pure conceptual emotional flow without any words at all, but I converted it to words weeks later when I was recording all my experience, that message from her to me was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. You can do no wrong. Now, I wish I'd explained that last piece, you can do no wrong, more fully in the book, because some people didn't get what I was trying to convey. And the conveyance was that in that realm, in that beautiful world of perfection, it was like a world of ideals in that Gateway Valley. That's where we go through life reviews. That's where all the things that you've done in your life with your soul group going through. Now, because of my amnesia, I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I absolutely saw life reviews. I'll get into that in just a second in the kind of form that they presented to me. But the amazing thing is that in that world, it's a world that's completely timeless. There is no longer an enslavement to earth time and the slow plodding, clocks of our earthly existence. You have birth, death, everything in between, events of past lives, potentials of future lives, all these things simultaneously presented. It's one of the reasons why these are ineffable. It's the mode of knowing is so much grander than our modes of information acquisition here in these bodies with our sensory systems. There's often something I call knowledge through identification, where you actually become huge swathes of the scene. And that includes in life reviews, because I've heard about the characteristics of life review, which we can go into a little later if you want to, from Bruce Grayson, who's a scientist who studied them extensively. But there are many features of them. They're more like a reliving of events than a remembering. About a third of people who have life reviews say it involves their entire life. And you might wonder, how does that happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest with no omissions? And it's because you're in a timeless realm. So it's very, very different from being in this earthly realm. And also the important thing, most important about life reviews, is 84% of those in Bruce Grayson's study said it was from the perspective of everyone involved. In other words, if you've handed out a lot of pain and suffering to others, in your life review, you become the others. So you feel what that felt like, that you were dishing that out to people. Also, love and kindness, that comes back to you too. But it's basically the golden rule written into the fabric of the universe in these life reviews. Treat others as you would like to be treated. At any rate, so that was the bigger message of you can do no wrong, is as long as you're following a pathway with your free will, choosing love, compassion, kindness, and mercy for your fellow beings, that's the most straightforward pathway. You can choose otherwise. You can make it worse, but that comes back to you in your life review, to mistreat others. At any rate, so in this beautiful Gateway Valley, all this incredible festivity going on, what then happened was I recognized that all of four-dimensional space-time, which I could vaguely sense below the spiritual realm, all of that collapsed down. Then all of this rich kind of eternal soul realm of spirituality, the Gateway Valley, all of that collapsed down. And I ascended through a light portal that was provided by the music of those angelic choirs. There was always a theme of music associated with these transitions between levels of the spiritual realm. And I entered what I call the core. The core was an infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with that unconditional love of the creator for the creation, of that God force. And when I say that, and I'll tell you, coming back from this journey, I call that deity Om, because to me, God was a puny little human word with a lot of baggage attached to it. And I also recognize that it doesn't matter if you want to call that loving sense of co-creative wisdom at the energy of the universe itself, that God force. You can call it God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, all the many words humans have attached to that central loving wisdom that they've sensed in these deep spiritual journeys for thousands of years. this is all an invitation to move beyond the petty, simplistic differences between religious thought and get right down to the message of the prophets, which is all about love, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, non-exclusive, very different from some of our modern religious ideologies. At any rate, in that core realm, I was told every time I entered there, because I would cycle through these levels multiple times, but on entering the core, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And some of the biggest lessons concerned the evidence for life review and for reincarnation, which I'd never considered a possibility in my earthly life before that. And yet it was clear to me from these visions that that was a huge part of understanding this nature of consciousness. And so in that core realm, I witnessed what I call the Indra's net vision of reality. And it was this vision of these multiple interwoven threads, this incredible fabric. And the interweaving of the threads was due to our roles as sentient beings. And the weave of the fabric was from birth, life, death, rebirth, life review, and then rebirth, et cetera, going through these cycles again and again, all of it not leading to that kind of notion in Buddhism of reincarnation where it's get off the wheel of suffering, but more of a grace-filled, love-inspired vision of this reincarnation, where our souls come back again and again, growing closer and closer with each incarnation towards that oneness with the divine. And it's just something that cannot be accomplished in one physical incarnation. And I wasn't aware of that reincarnation literature. We can go into that in a few minutes if you'd like, but the group from UVA, tremendous evidence supporting reincarnation. It's pretty much undeniable. But also, I will warn you, there's a process of programmed forgetting, so that by age 6 or 7, the children who have past life memories, which is probably about 7% of all kids in the Western world, by age 6 or 7, those memories are lost. They're going away. And they then have buy-in into this life without any reference to events of a past life, even though those events can be uncovered again through meditation, hypnotic regression, having an NDE, et cetera. So anyway, back to my story. I would cycle through these multiple levels, tumble back down to that earthworm eye view by remembering the musical notes of the melody that had been associated with that light portal, going back up into these realms again, that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing, always reassuring me with a presence. Many lessons, and that's been all the stuff I've talked about for 17 years since all this happened. Still unpacking through meditation. I meditate an hour or two a day, use sacred acoustics. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment, an incredible way to get in touch with this. But at the end of my NDE journey, after multiple cycles and lessons, etc., there came a point where I tried to conjure up through the memory of the musical notes that light portal to take me up out of the earthworm eye view, and it didn't work. Just as they told me, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. And I wasn't sure where I'd come to believe going back was back to that earthworm eye view, because I'd been through there multiple times and then relaunched into the spiritual realms. But now I was kind of stuck in that primitive earthworm eye view. To say I was sad would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust that I would be taken care of. I'd been promised that many a time by that beautiful spiritual guide and by that God force at the core of the universe in my core level. And in fact, an important point about that core level was I recognized that that God force of pure love was a direct source of my conscious awareness, just like it is for all of us. So we're never separate from that force of infinite love and healing at the core of the universe. We simply have to turn our attention towards it, and we can start harvesting the benefits of meditating and praying in reference to that beautiful, loving force. At any rate, the next thing I saw were thousands of beings going off into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, and from them was coming this murmuring energy. They were saying something, and yet my amnesia was still powerful. I didn't understand the words, but that it was very reassuring, this kind of murmuring energy coming from this kind of multitude of souls around me. And then, finally, there were 6 faces that appeared up out of the muck. The face would come out, say a few words that I didn't understand because of the amnesia. Then the face would dissolve back into the muck. Now, I remember those 6 faces as vividly today in my mind as if the whole thing happened yesterday. So it was a very powerful experience, and yet at the time they appeared to me, I didn't know who they were. They were important because it turns out that a few hours later, when I was coming out of coma, my brain was still quite frazzled from the meningitis. And initially, I didn't recognize loved ones at the bedside. But over an hour or two, those memories were coming back. I recognized them. My language was returning. And I realized that the faces that I saw were present, physically present in the ICU the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. There were many family and friends who had been there earlier in the week who were not in my memories. And what that told me, they serve as what are called veridical time anchors, so that those 6 faces basically told me that the vast majority of the spiritual journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of the 7-day coma. And that's very important for some of the neuroscientific arguments assessing this, who would postulate that all these memories formed when I came out of coma. And yet I had all the evidence from those faces appearing to me that the vast majority of the coma experience had to happen before that. And it was a journey, even though it was 7 Earth days, it seemed to go on for months or years. And it was the last of those 6 faces that's most important. That was a 10-year-old boy, and it was my son Bond. Now, I didn't recognize him at the time, and it turns out this is Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. I've gone from early in the week when the doctors expected a 10% chance of survival to late in the week without any signs of neurological recovery, where they're saying I've gone to a 2% chance of survival, but no chance of recovery. And therefore, they recommended stopping antibiotics, taking me off the ventilator. And it was a few hours after that decision that I started waking up and fighting the ventilator, and they were then forced to take out the breathing tube. And that's when I went, thank you. But my memories were just beginning to come back. All I knew at that time was the extraordinary spiritual journey I just had. My memories of Eben Alexander's life were still not coming back to me. That came back over hours and days, and in fact, all my memories returned within about 2 months, and they were more complete after that return than they had been before coma. That's something we discuss in detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, where we also discuss that modern neurosurgery is finally concluding that memories are not even stored in the brain. We can talk about all that too later. That's something that's covered in detail in Living in a Mindful Universe. At any rate, I spent about 2 months recovering from all this. There's much more to the overall story of my kind of accepting and coming to understanding of all this. But that, in essence, is the NDE as it occurred in my life.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
You bet.
That's intense.
Amazing
Okay.
experience.
It sounds amazing. I would assume that this lit a fire where you just started researching as much as you can. Now, here's where I wanna take this.
Can I make one
Yeah,
statement
of
about
course.
that?
Yeah.
This is so I was ecstatic. You bet. You got it. But I tried to tell my doctors about it. You know, in the first few days after coma, I was excited. Wow. And they would pat me on the back and say, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're coming back to us now, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Now, know at that time, I did not yet know all of my medical records. I didn't know just how sick I'd been. So I believed my doctors like we often do. I said, oh, so it was a vast hallucination. And I remember 2 days after I got out of the hospital, our older son, Eben the Fourth, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, he came home from school, drove overnight to surprise me. He'd heard I was so energized. I was staying up all night and writing down my memories, etc. And he gave me a big hug when he got there. And he told me later, it was like there was a light shining within me, like I was far more present than I'd ever been before. But I told him it was way too real to be real. That was the way I had to phrase it, given my doctors saying there's no way that has anything to do with reality. But they didn't realize just how deathly ill my brain had been. Only the neurologists did. They certainly were clued in on this. But that was a huge part of the mystery, was that I could have this extraordinary experience when, according to modern neuroscience, nothing should have been available to me at all. And yet seeing this incredibly rich, ultra-real spiritual journey when my brain was so incapacitated incapacitated. That was the mystery. And that's what kind of challenged me in those first weeks and months to make sense of this, because I came to realize as I reviewed my medical records, this was not lining up the way it should. This was not a dream or hallucination. It was far more than that. And my brain was far more damaged than I'd known up until that point.
Mm. Unbelievable. That is unbelievable. That is okay. So here's so like I said, fire, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this is this is realer than real. I got to learn more. The reason I say that is because there's not, if you spend a lot of time in this space and someone like you who caught the bug, right? And you're like, I need to know or understand what's going on. It's not long, really, before you start coming across some alternative stories. And I wanted to ask you about those
Okay.
because there is a, there, we all know the phrase, if there's smoke, there's fire, right? And when I look at religion, for example, Christianity, which is what I was raised in,
Uh-huh.
I can understand how that religion grows because there are a lot of things in the Bible that are actually very spiritual. And I think Jesus was actually a very spiritual person, and what he was kind of hijacked by religion. That's my belief. But
Yeah.
you could see where the act of prayer, the act of getting in groups and singing, and there's a lot in there where your life would improve. I mean, there's a lot of really good things in there. So it makes sense to me that that would grow, right? So that one makes sense. There are some that have grown that you got to go like, that's very interesting that it's not just one person, it's hundreds, if not thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know. I mean, the
Well,
internet is really starting to
billions is
open up
a better
connections, but
number.
the stories of, you know, that the darker part, right? If there's equal, like there's so much duality on the earth, right? That night, day, good, bad, everything. It's duality. But on that side, to have that love and this presence that you said, this God force, and to see the orbs in the sky and just the whole thing, the experience was just so beautiful and moving. Do you ever wonder about the other side of that? And if that's active on that side, like people say prison, that's the planet. Like, there's a prison planet, there's these darker beings. Do you ever come across that when you're doing your research?
Absolutely. That's a very important point. And in fact, to me, I'll tell you, as I was getting to know all this and the literature on it and more cases and meeting people who had had these, et cetera, the thing that was most surprising to me was, in spite of our very ego-besotted, narcissistic world, materialist world, the vast majority of people who have these things, 90% plus, are fully engaged, want to stay over there. They actually have to be kind of convinced of a reason to come back here. And that should give you an idea. Now, there are 3 to 5%, maybe slightly higher because they tend to be underreported, but those are the number of negative or hellish NDEs, and they are certainly out there. But the amazing thing is, when you read the hellish NDEs, they end up giving the same result as the positive NDEs. They end up, informing people that they need to be more loving and compassionate and kind and sharing and caring about their fellow person. So the hellish NDEs, in fact, I think often hellish NDEs are just the result of a life review when you were not necessarily very good to your fellow people. And we know there is some of that going on in this world where people are cruel to other people. And in the life review, you find out that is not the way to be, or at least you get to feel what it felt like. And in some
Hmm.
ways, you could say the life review is almost neutral. But given that it serves as a mirror to reflect back on you what you've done, and then people who have hellish NDEs because they experience what they were dishing out to others and it's not very pleasant, they come back to this world changed. They're changed for the better. So the life review still has that beautiful effect of kind of helping them to rise up to a higher spiritual level, which is really one of the higher good and of caring for others and of loving, basically sharing the love of the creator for the creation, I often put it, because we're co-creators. We have free will. We're given that gift, even though the materialism that I worship before my coma, and I don't use that word lightly, but that materialism would scoff at you for claiming to have free will. The materialist neuroscientific view is that it's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain, giving us an illusion of free will, illusion of conscious awareness. But that's where they have it completely wrong and backwards. And that's where the NDE community and where the neuroscientific world is going in response to, accommodate these kinds of experiences that are very, very common. that's where the world starts to grow in a very positive direction. But it's growing away from materialism with its false sense of separation. Reductive materialism teaches us up front we're all separate beings, particles are separate, and it's all about figuring out what the particles and beings and objects of this world, how they interact with each other. As opposed to recognizing that we're really sharing one mind. We're sharing that God mind, that God consciousness, and our brain serves as basically a little machine that dissociates out an eddy current of that primary God mind for us to use. And we think, oh, that's my consciousness. It's mine. It's private. Well, guess what? Telepathy is absolutely real. Read Guillaume Playfair's book, Twin Telepathy. You'll find that 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. And telepathy is out there, in Karen and I, my wife and partner in this work, we have telepathic experiences all the time. Now, you could say, well, we live together so we know each other. Yeah, but we also have incredible, detailed kind of telepathic experiences. The day I went to Coma, my birth mother, who I did not meet until 1 year before my coma, and then we had a lot of time together, back and forth, beach weekends, getting to know family, etc. But then about 3 months of no communication up until November 10th, 2008. She'd been in a business meeting. We hadn't communicated in 3 months. And she came back from her business meeting. No, oh my God, we've got a call. Something's wrong with him. I know it. And she called my family and found out I'd gone into coma that morning and was in the ICU and might not live. So that's a telepathic communication with my birth mother, even though we were separated the first 54 years of my life. But doesn't matter. There's still a deep connection. And so once you realize that mind is much more than just something that comes out of a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between your ears, but that you're sharing the mind of the universe and that we're all basically sharing that one mind, that's a tremendous shift in understanding from that false sense of separation of materialist thought. And this is the wave that is taking over the scientific community now, is something more like idealism. I would say that my preferred position is evolutionary panentheism, which is basically the notion. Panentheism means that God mind, that universal mind, is distributed across all sentient beings in their interpretation of the physical world. And the evolutionary part of the panentheism is that we have free will, and that's all due to quantum indeterminacy, which is very active at the level of neurons, at ion channels, synaptic vesicles. Everything going on in here is made up of quantum objects doing their thing with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, etc. So you can't no longer look at it as like Newtonian billiard balls on a billiard table, but quantum effects with top-down causality are very crucial at understanding how the brain and mind and consciousness and reality work. So it's been an extraordinary journey of discovery, trying to come to this deeper understanding. And luckily, the scientific community is rapidly evolving towards this much higher wisdom about the nature of reality.
Yeah, it feels that way. It definitely feels that way. I'm too dumb to even understand what any of that, how that all works. But it feels like there's a lot more people getting into the research of it and really trying to understand what is consciousness. Before we dive into that, because I do want to know, like, what have you learned? What is your, I want to talk about consciousness, but before you said that, there's a life review, and it's very common when you talk about life reviews to view this place as a school of some sort. You can call it a university or a training ground, pick your word, right? But for the point of getting closer to oneness, right, or understanding what you are, where's the value in remembering? Because it feels like everyone who's at an NDE or has these moments, they want to tell people about it, like, no, you're more than your body. But also it feels like the reason you're able to learn so much is because of the amnesia, because you forget that you are an all-powerful spirit or soul, and you are infinite, and you are a part of source. The value is that you forget, and then
Right.
that allows you to be immersed in this world But then why wake up? Where's the value in waking up, as everyone says?
Well, I think it's what's happening here is I like to think that the purpose for our existence and very much reflects the thinking of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He wrote a book in the mid 20th century called The Phenomenon of Man. And he was a French paleontologist and a Jesuit priest. So he had this spiritual side. And as a paleontologist, he was a scientist working on billion-plus-year timescales. So, his mind was working in that realm. And it was a time when scientific discussions about Darwinian evolution were still pretty prominent, trying to understand what biological evolution on Earth was all about. And he wrote that book and made it clear that evolution is real, but it's much grander than just biological systems on Earth. He said all of consciousness is evolving towards what he called a Christ consciousness, an omega point. And it's beyond Christian thought. This is really more about a God consciousness. And I think that's exactly what's going on, especially as you realize that we're all, when we refer to our mind, we're really talking about our shared part of the mind of the universe. So in many ways, the universe is going through a process of self-discovery through these interactions of sentient beings. So we're here to learn and teach with each other. And that's where the life review is important. That's where you come to recognize that, yes, meditation and prayer are an important part of this package, but ultimately it's what you do in your waking existence, working with your fellow beings, living in this world. That's important because that's how we come to learn the deeper lessons that this universe is trying to kind of learn and teach of itself. So it's really a process of discovery. As the entrance to the temple of the oracle at Delphi in Greece says, know thyself. And what is emerging from this modern scientific journey, and that is one that's very fully explicated in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, where we take consilience. That is, if you look at something deep like consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and I'll put it forward right here, the only thing any human being has ever known is the inside of their own consciousness. We do not have a window into some naked ultimate reality. We try to discover that, but in fact, what quantum physics has been screaming at us for the better part of a century is there is no objective physical world out there that's independent of the observer. That is an absolutely critical thing to get.
Can
And that
you
is the mystery of quantum physics, right in a nutshell, is that our mind is absolutely deeply integrated in the workings of our experimental designs to uncover the mysteries of the physical world. But we find that our results ultimately depend on choices made by that mind and how to do an investigation. So it's
if
none of it exists outside of mind. That's the important point.
can I challenge you to explain that as if you're talking to a 10-year-old? Like how would you say that to that? And I'm the 10-year-old.
Well, here it is. There are quotes from Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, Pascual Jordan, all these renowned fathers of the field in quantum physics that say we can't get behind consciousness. Consciousness seems to be fundamental in the universe. And that was because they were working. They were scratching the physical world around us, going right down to the atomic molecular level, photons, electrons, figuring out how those things that make up this world work. And what they found is those quantum objects, if whatever you want to call them, that the results of the experiments depend heavily on choices of the observer. And that comes out very specifically when you're looking at wave-particle duality and photons, electrons, what have you. What they discovered is that waves and particles seem to have a lot of crossover. And yet the interesting thing is you could never find that a particle would demonstrate wave and particle behavior at the same time. It's almost a nonsensical concept. So when the scientist decides how they're going to investigate this, like for example, in the double slit experiment, where you've got light going through two slits, and if it's properly set up, the light coming through the slits creates an interference pattern on the other side. If you don't know which slit a particle goes through, but if you put detectors on these two slits so that you know which of the slits the particle goes through, all of a sudden they behave like particles and not waves. Their interference pattern disappears. So it's an experimental result that you can do, and it's very mysterious. So when people first spotted this, they started wondering, how can it be? And then we've been through, a century or so of trying to understand that, and you come to recognize that it's kind of like there's a higher ordering of knowledge, and we have access to that, and it's something above and beyond the physical realm. And very importantly, I would say that the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 was given for entanglement, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. And Einstein refused to believe that quantum physics was a complete field. He thought there's something called hidden variables that would explain their behavior and would then maintain our four-dimensional space-time and a concept known as local realism. That's what Einstein was so powerfully defending against. And he said, God doesn't play dice with the universe, and yet Einstein was wrong. Because every experiment that's been done showed that entanglement is true, and it cannot be explained by hidden variables. And that was all through the work of John Bell, an Irish physicist in 1964, who responded to a paper from Einstein 30 years earlier, the EPR paper, where Einstein made his claims that quantum physics was incomplete and that the hidden variables would finally explain it someday. And that's when John Bell came up with this inequality where you can use statistics on particles and figure out, is it hidden variables or does it rise to the level of true entanglement? And what every experiment has shown over 40 plus years of investigation, and that's why John Clauser, Alain Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger won that Nobel Prize in 2022 for entanglement. And entanglement is finally an admission by the Nobel Prize Committee that four-dimensional space-time is not the ultimate theater of operations, that there are other natural pathways of information transfer through this universe that allow for instantaneous information to allow particles to behave properly, even when they've been entangled but separated by great distances. And there are tricks that people have come up with to try and fool the particles, and you can't do it. And they always act as if they're being observed. That's the thing that where you really gotta, once you get into quantum mechanics and start uttering more of what's going on. And the reason it makes any difference at all to anybody is because our mind, which we would like to think is at least associated with our brain, and yes, it is associated, but it's not produced by the brain. That's the important thing. But the brain participates in this one mind by allowing through dissociation a certain amount of information that we use, as a human being living in this world, and yet we still have access to those parameters that allow us to demonstrate something as deep as entanglement in the physical world around us. So I don't know I hope I've clarified a little something.
It's a smart 10-year-old you're talking to over there. Okay, I want to ask you about one more thing about the school concept. Do you agree that you could learn a lesson, like let's say the concept of forgiveness in a bunch of different ways? Like it's not one way you learn about forgiveness, right? There's probably hundreds, maybe infinite ways that you could.
And forgiving self is important as forgiving others. And that's where the higher soul comes in handy, to forgive the kind of ego self, a little petty self, for some of the erroneous kind of choices it may have made, and to forgive it, and to forgive others. I mean, forgiveness and gratitude are two of the biggest, most powerful ingredients for life we have as human beings that I think are vastly underused. I found gratitude to be present in every breath I've taken for the last 17 years, because I've come to recognize the beautiful gift of this existence. And that includes, all the kind of warts and dirty underbelly of my existence that was experienced in that incredible near-death experience from almost dying, from having a brain filled with pus. I was gifted with this beautiful knowledge to share. So for me, it's all gravy.
No, I love it. So, but forgiveness, right? You can learn that in a bunch of different ways. I guess where I was getting at is, if you can learn things in different ways, there are certain scenarios where you come into a life and there are people, you could say kids, people who are born into situations that are just, even the word horrible and horrendous, none of that even, it doesn't even do it justice, right? These are really terrible ways to exist. And do you think we choose that, or is there an element of when we're planning to come in here, when we reincarnate? I just can't see if it's about learning. I can't see why anyone would choose those specific lives. So it's a roll of the dice a little bit, or because if there's whatever lesson is in that horrible experience,
Right.
there's probably another easier way to
Well,
experience that
I'll put it
lesson.
this way. First of all, I think some people get a little confused. They think that their ego mind might choose those hardships, and that is absolutely not true. But
Mhm.
when you put yourself in the position of kind of that higher soul, the higher soul knows that death of the body is not into the soul. In fact, it knows that death, uh, far more commonly than not, offers tremendous lessons to everybody involved. The people who are dying, to loved ones around them, healthcare workers, et cetera, all get a tremendous value out of the dying process. Now, my evidence for that, one big piece of evidence is go to the writings of Christopher Kerr, Kerr. He wrote a book called Death is But a Dream, came out about 8 or 10 years ago, I think. But Christopher Kerr is head of Hospice Buffalo. He doesn't care about near-death experiences. He's a doctor who's working with terminally ill patients. That's what he cares about. But what he found in his book completely confirms all these statements from near-death experiencers that when you die, your loved ones appear to you. And it's not a hallucination or dream. They're really there. That's the important thing to get. And they've are there to serve to escort us over. And also when I talk about reincarnation, very important for people to realize love and connection with our soulmates is such a dominant theme in this discussion that there's no way on earth that your loved one would have ever reincarnated before you get there. That's a concern a lot of people have, and I can reassure you from everything I know about this that because of the dominant theme of love, that never would a loved one be unavailable to you because they, quote, already reincarnated. And a big piece of the supporting information for that is to look at these life reviews. As Bruce Grayson reported them, he's a skeptical psychiatrist who's been working in this field for 45 years, and he reported on almost 700 life reviews in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021. And that's where some of those facts I gave a few minutes ago come from. But that 33% of people, it's a reliving of their entire life. It's not a vague, dreamy remembering, but this is reliving. And not only that, as we said, 84% of people, the life review is from perspective of everybody involved. Now,
Mhm.
that is showing us when you realize that life reviews are not just some vague memory of things, but a reliving, often of complete reliving of life events, and that from the perspective of all involved, you realize the universe has some profound kind of tools to show us this deeper reality. And the fact that these life reviews, which occur in about 1/2 of all NDEs, and probably at least 13 to 15 million people in the United States have had a near-death experience. That's a lot of people having these experiences. Something like 18 to 20% of cardiac arrest patients have an NDE. That's a whole lot of patients. And that's an important thing to get, because it's not like these are just occasional vague anomalies. These are so common. A bunch of our neighbors, we live in a very kind of conservative, staid little neighborhood here of mainly some older folks, a few kids around, but we've heard stories in our neighborhood of profound kind of NDEs and after-death communications. So they're out there all over the place. The problem is people are a little scared to talk about them because they're so shocking and unexpected. And yet, for so many people, I love that Proof of Heaven has opened the door to let many, many, many people come out and share their own story. I wrote the book partially to educate the medical profession, because once you educate the medical profession, you take the lid off of this, because there are so many of these cases that are overwhelming. But to date, the medical profession in general has been a little guarded about this. They're slowly opening up and starting to share this more and more. But the other important thing to point out is, for example, in the case report on my medical records, the peer review editor said, oh, wait a minute, this case doesn't make any sense. It's absurd. it's a word they use, that somebody that sick from bacterial meningoencephalitis would end up having a full recovery. How do you explain it? They challenged the authors of the paper. Now, the authors were not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what allowed for this unprecedented, miraculous recovery that defies medical expectations. That is the key message for all of us. They knew of other cases of near-death experiences, like Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me. She had an advanced stage 4 lymphoma, should have been dead within hours. She got into an emergency room in Hong Kong in 2006 and ended up having a profound NDE where she came back knowing her cancer would disappear. And it did. It just went away. It evaporated. It wasn't even attacked by her immune system. The cancer cells just involuted. They died. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon, she wrote a book called To Heaven and Back. She had a profound NDE during over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, in which her kayak went deep underwater, broke both her legs under a boulder. Finally, her friends were able to rescue her 30 minutes later, brought her to the surface dead, but resuscitated her. And there was an ambulance out of nowhere up in the jungle here in Chile, that took her to a hospital, and she ended up making a full recovery. So the message for all of humanity is these deep spiritual journeys result in this incredible healing. All of us are spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. We have power to influence our emerging reality. So I've come as a physician to realize that healing, wholeness, and well-being is something that's naturally gifted to us the more we can come to glimpse these beautiful connections we have with the universe at large and serve as conduits for that love, compassion, and kindness from that God force at the core of the universe, and we serve as conduits to bring that to our fellow beings. That's where a lot of this healing comes from, to serve for the higher good, and to get away from the horrible toxicity of ego and narcissism, which is just a deadly thing. We're seeing it at big action in politics in the current era. But the bottom line is we all have a pathway beyond all that takes us into a far richer life of discovery and understanding of our relationship, shared meaning and purpose with the universe, and an acknowledgement that we have the power to bring physical, mental, and emotional healing through our own spiritual healing and wholeness.
Do you think that your NDE was planned, or do you think it was a gift that you were given?
Well, I think, NDEs are always there for one purpose, and that is to help the soul who has them come to a deeper understanding of their purpose in life, their relationship with the universe at large, kind of the meaning of it all. And that's the only reason they're there. However, if you study them scientifically in large numbers, like the group at the University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies, and your listeners can go to uvadops.org to learn a lot more about that, all their books and papers, et cetera. A tremendous amount of scientific evidence is available there. You start to realize that they paint quite a picture when you assemble them. They're painting this picture of the reality of this God force, the power of prayer, that we're all truly spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, that we have tremendous abilities to manifest free will, bringing ourselves and the world into wholeness and healing. So there are tremendous lessons there. But ultimately, NDEs are just there to help the individual who has them come to a deeper understanding. So mine is just like all these other millions of NDEs out there. It just so happens mine is also of interest to the neuroscientific community because meningitis is such a perfect model for human death. So in that sense, my NDE contributes, some additional knowledge to the field, but I would say all NDEs contribute a tremendous amount to the field. When I find I've, met and talked with thousands of NDEers, and I love presenting at meetings where most of the people there are NDEers because there's this communication that's far above and beyond the words that's going on. It's a heartfelt, authentic kind of connection. Just like I think a lot of people felt when Proof of Heaven hit with such a big splash back in 2012 because they were trying to answer their own questions. They recognized things in my journey that were similar to theirs. And I think that's where this kind of bigger discussion can be helpful to all of us. And this is why I greatly encourage people who've had these experiences, and not just near death, they're also shared death experiences, which happen in perfectly healthy people, often a relative who maybe is 1,000 miles away, but their soul gets whisked along by the dying soul. Also, after-death communications, which probably happen in more than half of our society, after-death communications that are very convincing and that have real information important in the moment, not just wishful thinking or some vague dream state, but powerful information coming from loved ones who have left the physical plane. But it helps us in this life. For example, a friend of ours, Larry Burke, wrote a book about dreams that can save your life. And it was all about people who dreamed that they had a breast tumor. So he was talking about breast cancer. That was his thing. And he found a number of cases where people had had premonitory dreams that told them to go to the doctor, have a mammogram, what have you. So in other words, this information cannot just be comforting and reassuring, but actually important to us in living our lives, like medical importance, that kind of thing. But all of this comes from being much more attuned to that spiritual world and shifting our beliefs, as opposed to just doubting everything and being a hardcore materialist and saying, I only believe it if it's proven by the scientific method, to opening up to, well, guess what? Consciousness is such a deep mystery that at this stage of the game, it's hard for us to come up with scientific studies to do a true, randomized controlled trial to come up with the answers. But we need to take what nature and the universe are giving us for free. These, anecdotal cases assembled by the thousands and millions start to paint a very clear picture of a bigger reality, a reality that involves our spiritual nature and the power of our will and of our higher soul to influence our emerging reality.
Yeah, I always found it interesting, like, because we only know about the NDEs because the people came back, right? Like, there's, I wonder, because everyone who came back, at least most of the time, maybe not all of them, definitely not all of them, but a lot of them say they want to stay. And then they come back. And so I'm always like, man, what, I wonder what decides or who decides or how it's decided that this person goes, because by all intents and purposes, you should have been dead, right? I mean, everything pointed to you not making it.
Right.
And it's almost like, manipulation is maybe the wrong word, but something happened there where they're like, I want you to come back. And maybe it's because you are the perfect person to dive into the science side of consciousness, and maybe that's why
I certainly have contributed to that discussion, but I would say I've learned a tremendous amount from thousands of other NDEs that I've encountered. I think the other important thing to point out, I would say that all of our religious traditions have emerged from somebody having something like an NDE, some challenge, some big something that opened their eyes to a bigger sense of reality. And so that's where the golden rule has emerged from all religions, from those kinds of near-death type things. But also know that for most of human history, the vast majority of people who had cardiac arrest went on to die. In the late 1960s, doctors discovered modes of cardiac resuscitation. And so since the late 60s, we populated this world with millions and millions of people who have been to the other side and come back. As Pim van Lommel showed in his paper in The Lancet in 2001, he's a Dutch cardiologist. He did a prospective study, very important. Instead of a retrospective where you say, who here has had an NDE? Tell me about it. You go, all right, let's take all of this population and walk forward. And whoever has a heart attack, let's see if they end up having an NDE or not. And that gives you a much better idea of how common these things truly are when you're just looking at all these people as a population and then watch who has heart attacks. And what he found is 1/5 of the people who had cardiac arrest ended up having some elements of a near-death experience. That's a lot of people. That's why we've got probably 15 million Americans who have had a profound NDE walking around this world right now. And a lot of them, they know how real it was. It was shocking. And they want more answers than it's the materialist trying to tell them, oh, it's a dream or hallucination.
Yes.
And that's why the science is now stepping up to the plate to give them a much bigger picture of it all. And I want to share one link. This is For anybody who doubts the scientific evidence of the afterlife, go to bigelowinstitute.org. Very important website. You'll find 29 essays, all available for free to the reading public right now at bigelowinstitute.org. And those essays were written by scientists who all demonstrated at least 5 years working experience in investigating the afterlife question. And you start reading those essays and you'll realize very quickly that the scientific basis for the afterlife and reincarnation is beyond dispute. And you can have materialist scientists and atheist scientists who come racing out at you and say, there's no such thing as an afterlife. These people are hallucinating or dreaming. And you say, you haven't read any of the 29 bigelowinstitute.org essays, have you? They're basically expressing willful ignorance. End of story.
Do you think that the Earth is an infinite game and it goes on and there's just new players that come in and then they do the cycle, they reincarnate till they graduate? I'm just going to say that as just a way to end it. Or do you think this place has an end goal? I mean, is there a moment?
We're evolving. I do not even remotely pretend to be able to define a quote end goal, but I can tell you at this stage of human development, and I would say that this revolution that I'm talking about, and that's the revolution that we express in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that revolution about the one mind and about our shared consciousness, that is something that is inevitable because of the evidence supporting it. And that if you go to bigelowinstitute.org, you're going to find a tremendous amount of evidence that ties all of this together and starts to point this direction. The same thing is true of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. This is the evidence is there. And some people are maybe ignorant of it. They haven't studied it. They're unaware, what have you. But that doesn't mean that they have a valid voice in stating an opinion on whether or not NDEs are real and the afterlife is real. But the scientific study of it is very profound and undeniable. And I will say that one of the biggest chunks of that evidence, and something I didn't know about before my coma, but have learned a lot about since then, is the reincarnation data. And as I said earlier, it was very clear to me in my NDE that reincarnation was a huge part of understanding human existence. And I didn't realize how much scientific evidence is there. But at UVA Division of Perceptual Studies, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children over the last 6 or 7 decades. And in those cases, 1,700 have been solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived before. And many of those cases were from the 60s, 70s, 80s, before the internet. Some of the cases are absolutely extraordinary. There's one that's in a book called Soul Survivor, S-O-U-L Survivor, that I can highly recommend if you want to see just how grand these reincarnation stories can get. But Jim Tucker wrote a beautiful book called Before. He was the head of Division of Perceptual Studies until recently. He's just stepped down about a year ago. But he took over the work of Ian Stevenson. But the UVA data is overwhelming. There's just no way to read those cases and come away saying, no, there's nothing to it. It's all made up.
Where's it at? UVA?
Sorry?
What's it called? UVA?
UVA, University of Virginia.
Okay.
The University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. They're in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's about 12 miles from where I'm sitting. I work with a lot of the people at DOPS, as they're called, and they do incredibly good work. If you go to uvadops.org, you'll have access to a lot of their papers, a lot of their books, a lot of their interviews and presentations. They're an incredibly powerful group, and specifically, I would recommend Ed Kelly's books, but these are only for the really hardcore scientific mind. I mean, they're 800 pages, they're dense scientific data, but boy, do they get you there. Irreducible Mind is the first book, then Beyond Physicalism in 2015, and his most recent book is called Consciousness Unbound. So Edward F. Kelly, he's a brilliant writer, very bright mind. He's worked with Jim Tucker, did all the reincarnation work with Bruce Grayson, has done all the near-death experience work, and other investigators at UVA DOPS. But they are doing a world of good to help wake this planet up.
I love it. I want to end with this. Is there is there anything about consciousness specifically that you feel most people are missing or it's misunderstood or anything you've found that you want to share with the audience around
Well, it's mainly
consciousness?
that consciousness is the only thing that exists. The physical universe is emergent from the realm of consciousness. The whole science of life reviews shows us just how powerfully the universe has the tools to demonstrate to us that it cares about our actions as human beings, and that we should care, as being sentient beings, and pay attention to what we're doing. And that ultimately, all these lessons and this incredible kind of scientific adventure of discovery is teaching us to love one another, take care of each other, show compassion, mercy, and kindness to each other. And of course, that starts with being kind and forgiving of yourself, but it also is very important to put your little ego into timeout and start coming into a higher soul. And that's where I strongly encourage people to meditate. And for many, recognize the voice in your head is not your consciousness. The voice in your head is, as Michael Singer put it in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head the annoying roommate. That is it. Your higher soul, your consciousness is far grander than that. And you can step above and beyond the petty little demands of your ego with all of its addictions and everything else it'll trap you with, and start becoming more of the soul you truly came here to be with greater wisdom through meditation. Anybody who needs help in silencing that little monkey mind voice in the head, use sacredacoustics.com. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. We write about it extensively in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And also, if you go to my website, ebenalexander.com, right there on the welcome page, there's a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness, a little banner that wiggles in your face. You leave your email address and first name there, and you're off and running a 33-day email drip campaign where you'll receive each day an email with a major concept from Living in a Mindful Universe. And you also get in those 33 days 4 Sacred Acoustics audio files to help in meditation. A lot of mention of meditation in that 33-day course, so we'll kind of guide you through it. And more than 14,000 people have taken that course to date. They leave their comments. So when you get involved in that 33-day journey, you've got a lot of people who have left comments and their own experiences on each and every page. So there's a tremendous amount of resource you can use to get to this understanding. But meditation, centering prayer, going within, and then living that life that you discover of love, light, and compassion.
Dr. Eben Alexander, this was awesome.
Well,
This was
Segi,
awesome.
thanks
This
so
was a
much
really
for
great
having me on.
conversation. Yeah.
Greatly appreciate your getting this out there, and maybe we can talk again someday.
I would love to talk to you again. And I will link all of your books. I'll link your website. I'll link everything down below. I'm going to find these websites you talked about too. So I'll leave a nice little description for everyone listening, so you guys can just click the links, go read the stories, everything you brought up today. So
And
I'm
the
excited
last
to
little
release this.
website that also has a lot of information, innersanctumcenter.com.
Okay.
INNER sanctumcenter.com. And you'll see it when you get there. There are multiple options. One thing is 50 interviews we did every 2 weeks during the pandemics with other thought leaders in consciousness, experiencers, etc. And that in itself is a gold mine. But there are other things available, innersanctumcenter.com.
All right. I'm excited. Well, I'm stoked to release this episode. I will send you an email when it's done. So I
All right,
appreciate you.
Segi, thanks a lot. Great
All
for
right. Cheers.
talking with you. You take care.
Same. Bye.
All right, talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.